You're listening to Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless.
Welcome to today's episode of Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless. Peter, welcome back.
It's good to be back and always good to be here.
Okay, we're now up to our seventh episode in this series, and in our previous episodes we've touched on, in passing, the concept of the Trinity, and we've dug into it a little bit in places. Can we now turn our attention to the question, who is Jesus? Our faith sort of stands or falls on our answer to that question, I believe. The historical evidence for a man named Jesus, or that's our translation of it, coming from a place called Nazareth, is very compelling. Many will accept that he was a great teacher, maybe even a prophet, but historically the church has held the view that he was and is the Son of God, and in fact God himself. So who is Jesus?
Well, that's a very, very big question. And of course, in a program like this, with the short snippets we've got, we can barely touch on it. And I hope that as we give the answers, it's going to stimulate the desire of the listeners to make some serious inquiries here, and not to do what so many of us often do, and that is have a quick opinion and then dismiss something. Or have a quick opinion and then embrace something that might be true, but we've only got a shallow understanding of it. To reflect on the nature of Jesus and who Jesus is one of the most enthralling and beautiful things that you can actually do. So let's start with the way that the church, the Christian church, over the centuries, has opened the conversation on who is Jesus. And there's a little phrase, or a little statement is the best way to put it, sometimes called the Apostles' Creed, earlier derived from a thing called the Rule of Faith. Interestingly enough, this little thing called the Apostles' Creed, or the Rule of Faith, later on expanded into the Nicene Creed, for those who know about these things. This little statement, coming from about the year, its origins can be traced in writing to about the year 120, which means it preceded that. Now, if Jesus died in the year 33, right, 120, that's how many years after that? Let's say about 87 years later. All right, that's not a long time, because what's 87 years ago from now? It's 2023, so you go back about the 1940s, the beginning of the Second World War. And for those who understand history, that's fairly recent. And so you're looking at something which was written down 87 years after, but had preceded that. And so we're looking at something that fits into the concept of living memory. And so the amazing thing, and in the scriptures themselves, we actually have some passages that even opponents of Christianity have said go back to the first few months after the resurrection in terms of physical evidence. So the evidential stuff for Jesus is huge, but it's not the kind of thing you can sit down and just rattle off on a program like this. But let's go back to this thing called the Apostles' Creed. Basically, it says that Jesus Christ was born of the Virgin Mary, conceived of the Holy Ghost, born of the Virgin Mary. Okay, we've got to take that on a statement of faith, and the reality of the resurrection, and incredibly miraculous, and the reality of his miracles. If you accept those, then, and the testimony of the truth of the passages, of the records we have of that, then the virgin birth is itself not at all preposterous, and that was attested to us by Luke. Okay, and Luke actually, when you look at it, interestingly enough, Greg Sheridan wrote an interesting book on this, the Australian journalist, and there are others who say it's an interesting thing when you read it. Luke has the authenticity of a journalist who had conducted an interview with Mary, and it was she who told him how Jesus was born. She told the story of his birth, as mothers do to people, right? And so that beautiful account of the birth of Jesus and the events leading up to it in the Gospel of Luke are really precious and special. And as Sheridan said, they exude journalistic authenticity, which is quite fascinating. Okay, so that's the virgin birth. The next thing, it says he suffered under Pontius Pilate. That's an amazing thing, because Pontius Pilate is a historical person who is attested to. In other words, we know that there was this person, Pontius Pilate, and there are Roman records that speak of Pontius Pilate being the governor in Judea at the time that the Apostles' Creed and the Gospels suggest he was. So there's evidence that he was there and that he suffered under him. and that he was executed under him. And I think the Roman historian Tacitus, who was not favourable to Christianity, observed it, and also Josephus, a controversial person at the same time, whose writings are extant. So the fact that Jesus was a historical, actual person is really quite... the evidence is overwhelming. In fact, there's more evidence for it than the idea that Julius Caesar existed.
Yeah, I've read that before. I think it might have even been something really simple like Josh McDowell's Evidence That Demands a Verdict, and which is a really simple, easy to read sort of statement on these things. But yeah, that we have no problem accepting Julius Caesar or some of these other historical figures, King Tutankhamun and things like that. But there's actually more historical and historically verifiable by all the standard measures evidence for a man called Jesus than there was for those people.
Yes, it's interesting too when you consider that when we walk around with these things called Bibles, right, and modern translations of them, and translations vary. But people say, because we can read anything out of the Bible. Well, no, you can't. You can't. You can claim anything means anything, whether it's Robinson Crusoe or the Bible. It doesn't matter. The reality is that if you're going to do disciplined reading, most serious Bible scholars who do disciplined reading of it come up with pretty much the same set of conclusions. And what's wonderful is you do get sets of variations. And I think I've mentioned this before. When people say, well, how come so many people have different opinions? I said, well, it's because all of us are different. The way we see and understand and perceive things changes, is different when we look at things. And I remember my daughter asked me about this once, and I said, well, just think about this. Think of the Mona Lisa. Nobody doubts the Mona Lisa exists. It's hanging on the wall in that museum in Paris. It's probably the most watched or looked at painting in the world. I'd say millions of people have looked at it, but no two people have exactly the same way of describing it.
Yeah, and that, to me, has always added to the authenticity of the four gospel accounts because they're different enough. You can see they're actually people writing from their perspective. They haven't conspired to produce four cohesive accounts. There's like enough differences to go, well, that doesn't say the same as that, but you see things differently. As you said, different people see things through their own lenses. So, of course, they're going to perceive it differently.
They've written their own responses, and that's exactly true. So if you read Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, you can see they're all talking about the same thing, but Matthew's not Mark, and Mark is not Luke, and Luke is not John. And the idea that there might have been a common source that Matthew, Mark, and Luke worked from, and there was probably another person there, and each had their own perspective. And so Matthew probably had to adjust what sometimes they call this person Q. Whether they exist or not is another thing. Matthew had a different perspective to Q, so he wrote what he needed to. Mark did the same, and Luke did the same. And then John wrote from a completely different angle. So the very fact that there are differences in views is, I've heard people who understand the taking of evidence in criminal cases actually say that the very fact that they're different actually strengthens the evidence, because one of the things that people know when people are telling lies often is the stories line up too tightly, which means they've been colluding on what they're going to say.
It's been rehearsed.
It's been rehearsed. So there's all of these threads and streams of evidence. The other thing also, speaking about the writings of the records of Julius Caesar and these others, in those days, it's only been very recently that we've had printing presses. Okay, up until that time, people laboriously had to write out and make copies by hand. And the quality of paper or things they wrote on didn't last all that long. And so the idea of having a manuscript which is a reliable copy, so for example, with Julius Caesar, I can't remember the number of centuries, but the oldest manuscripts of the existence of Julius Caesar are centuries younger than the oldest manuscripts we have of copies of the New Testament and the Old Testament. So the sheer evidentiary base, if we're prepared to believe in Julius Caesar or King Tutankhamun or all of these people, we've got far more evidence of the reality of the fact that Jesus Christ lived, that he suffered under Pontius Pilate and was crucified and died and was buried and rose from the dead. The evidence for his resurrection is overwhelming. And there are huge books written on. I'd really recommend that people take a look. You can even get on YouTube videos of Gary Habermas going through it on the resurrection. And N.T. Wright's massive tome on the resurrection, where he discusses it in minute detail, indicates, yes, the resurrection happened. So Jesus Christ is quite amazing.
So historically, then, we can say with 99.99% confidence that there was a man. He lived historically in that time frame. There's plenty of third-party evidence of that he did go through the processes that we see in the Scripture, that he walked around, he performed what were perceived as miracles, and that through his own death and obviously the ultimate miracle of his own resurrection, we can pretty much lock that down in concrete, that guy was there. But
yes.
Then we as the church, as believers, take that a step further and say, well, this was actually God and the Son of God.
Yes.
So where do we bring that from?
Okay, from Jesus' own claims. Jesus made it very, very clear that he was in fact God. In fact, part of the reason he was crucified was because the religious authorities of the time considered he was blasphemous for suggesting that he was who he was. Now, one of the there's no ambiguity about the idea that Jesus didn't claim that he in fact was God himself. Right?
He definitely made that claim.
Yes, and the idea of the Son of God does not mean something created by God. The Son of God, the idea of God the Father and God the Son, is more analogous to the idea of head and tails of the same coin. The Father can't be a Father without a Son, because it's the Son that makes the Father the Father. The Son can't be a Son without the Father, because it is the Father that makes the Son the Son. And so these words, Father and Son, are to help us to understand that the Arche and the Logos, the Father, the Son, the source of being and the expression of being are the same thing. As one 19th century theologian put it, he said, we have the thought in our mind, and when we speak the word is the expression of the thought, and the thought and the word are one. Jesus is called the Word, the Logos. And these are the claims that he made about himself. And in the Gospel of John, there are 7 times he says, I am. When Moses asked God, what's your name? God basically said, my name is I am. Exodus chapter 33. And again, these are things that we can throw out quickly on a radio conversation, but I really do invite you listeners to do some serious study of this and get hold of some people who can explain it to you, because it is awesome in its glory, it's awesome in its truth, and it is so connected to the reason for your being.
It ties back to, I always remember, I'm pretty sure it was C.S. Lewis in Mere Christianity, basically said he's either the Lord, a liar, or a lunatic.
Yes, Lewis's famous
and that always struck me, that really when you read what Jesus claimed about himself, they're your only options.
Yes, Lewis's famous trilemma, the 3 things. He's either the Lord, he claims to be, he's a liar, or he's a lunatic of the sort that thinks he's a poached egg.
That's right, he did say that,
Lewis's
didn't he?
words, yes.
And, I mean, I think you've only got a cursory read of his teachings in the gospel. You can pretty quickly rule out lunatic.
Yes.
Because he makes so much sense, his teaching and that. And is he a liar? Well, 2,000 years later, the church still stands, which sort of bears testimony to the fact that the man wasn't a liar. So it only really leaves you one option.
Yes, he is who he claims to be himself. So a lot of this hinges around the reality of his historical existence and the historical event of the resurrection, which, by the way, is the whole reason we celebrate Christmas and Easter.
Exactly right.
To recall and those supernatural, glorious events that tell us human beings who we are.
Yeah, the bookends of his time on earth, in a way, but they define our faith.
Absolutely.
I think, Pete, we will leave that there for today. There's a lot of meat there, and I'd like us in our next episode, we'll go and talk a bit about Jesus' mission, if you like, his time on earth, why it had to be what it was, and just unpack that a bit further. But yeah, I think we've really set some boundaries around that and defined some scope on that beautifully. Thanks, Beth.
Think About It with Pastor Peter Carbless is a production of Rema.cc.